The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden trading post that sat like a lonely island in the vast desert. Inside the cramped building, men with weathered faces and cruel eyes counted coins while discussing their latest cargo. Behind the main structure, hidden from casual view, stood a series of iron cages that housed human beings like animals. 8-year-old Maria pressed her small face against the cold metal bars, her dark eyes searching the horizon for any sign of hope. Beside her, her twin brother Carlos sat curled in the corner, his thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs. They had been torn from their mother's arms 3 weeks ago, when slave traders raided their small village near the Mexican border. The twins remembered every detail of that terrible morning. Their mother, Isabella, had been hanging laundry when the riders appeared like dust devils across the plain. She had screamed for her children to run, but there was nowhere to go. The men on horseback were faster, their ropes longer, their hearts harder than the desert stones. Maria reached through the bars and touched her brother's hand. "Carlos, remember what Mama told us about being brave?" she whispered in Spanish. Her voice carried the wisdom of a child forced to grow up too quickly. She said, "Even when we cannot see her, she is watching over us." Carlos lifted his tear-stained face. "But Maria, what if we never see her again? What if they take us far away where she cannot find us?" His voice cracked with the weight of fears too heavy for such young shoulders. The iron cage measured barely 6 feet by 6 feet, forcing the twins to stay close together. The floor was covered with dirty straw that smelled of previous prisoners. A tin cup of murky water and a piece of stale bread had been their only meal that day. The traders treated them worse than they would treat their horses. As the afternoon wore on, Maria noticed something different about the sounds coming from the trading post. Usually there was laughter and the clink of bottles, but today the voices seemed nervous and hushed. She strained her ears to catch fragments of conversation drifting through the hot air. "Apache been seen in these parts," one man was saying. "Tracker found signs near the water hole yesterday." "Just rumors," another voice replied, but it lacked conviction. "Ain't seen Apache this far south in months." Maria's heart began to beat faster. She had heard stories about the Apache warriors, how they moved like shadows across the desert and appeared where least expected. Some people feared them, but Maria remembered her grandmother's words about how the Apache were fierce protectors of their homeland. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Maria watched the colors change and thought about her home, where she and Carlos would help their mother prepare dinner as the day ended. They would sit together on their small porch, sharing stories and watching the stars appear one by one. A movement in the distance caught Maria's attention. At first she thought it might be a coyote or perhaps a lizard scurrying across the rocks, but as she looked more carefully, she realized it was something else entirely. Someone was moving out there, staying low and using the landscape for cover. Carlos noticed his sister's intense focus and crawled over to peer through the bars beside her. "What do you see?" he asked quietly. "I think someone is watching this place," Maria whispered back. "Look there, by that big rock shaped like a sleeping bear." They both stared at the formation and suddenly a figure rose from behind it for just a moment before disappearing again. It was a man, but he moved differently than the traders. His movements were fluid and purposeful, like water flowing around obstacles. The twins held their breath as they continued to watch. Other figures began to appear at different points around the trading post, materializing from the desert floor like spirits. They wore clothes that blended with the earth and rocks, making them nearly invisible until they chose to be seen. Maria felt something she had not experienced since their capture: hope. These were not more slave traders or settlers. These were Apache warriors, and they were surrounding the trading post with the patience of hunters who knew their prey could not escape. As darkness began to fall, the twins heard new sounds. The traders inside the building were moving around more frantically now, their voices rising with alarm. Someone had spotted the Apache and the hunters had become the hunted. The Apache warrior named Ayana crouched behind a cluster of barrel cacti, his weathered hands gripping a rifle that had seen many battles. He had been tracking the slave traders for 2 days, following their trail of broken dreams and stolen lives across the unforgiving desert. His keen eyes studied every detail of the trading post, counting enemies and noting their weapons. Ayana was not alone. 6 other warriors had spread themselves around the settlement like a tightening noose. They communicated through bird calls and hand signals, their coordination perfected through years of fighting together. Each man knew his role in what was about to unfold. The warrior's face was marked with the deep lines that come from squinting into desert winds and blazing sunlight. His long black hair was tied back with a strip of leather, and his clothes were the color of sand and stone. He had painted 2 red stripes across his cheekbones, the war paint of his clan. Years ago, Ayana had lost his own sister to slave traders much like these. She had been taken during a raid on their village, sold into a life of misery somewhere far to the south. He had never found her, despite searching for 3 seasons. The memory of her terrified screams still haunted his dreams, fueling his determination to free others from the same fate. Through his careful observation, Ayana had spotted the iron cages behind the main building. He could see small figures moving inside them, and his heart burned with righteous anger. Children. The traders were dealing in children, the most innocent of victims. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Ayana gave a low whistle that sounded exactly like a nighthawk. It was the signal his men had been waiting for. The time for watching was over. The time for action had begun. Inside the trading post, a man named Bronson wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cooling evening air. He was the leader of this group of human traffickers, a man whose conscience had been buried beneath years of greed and cruelty. His hand shook as he loaded his pistol, trying to appear calm in front of his 5 companions. "Maybe they'll just move on," suggested Pete, the youngest of the group. His nervous energy made him pace back and forth like a caged animal. "Apache don't usually bother with places like this." "Shut up, Pete," Bronson snapped. "Apache don't show themselves unless they mean business. They've been watching us, studying us. They know exactly how many we are and what we're carrying." The truth was that Bronson had made many enemies during his years in the slave trade. He had cheated Apache families, sold their captured relatives to buyers in distant cities, and shown no mercy to anyone who stood in his way. He knew that eventually his past would catch up with him. In the iron cage, Maria and Carlos huddled together as they listened to the growing panic inside the building. The voices of their captors had become sharp with fear, and the twins could hear furniture being moved around as the men prepared to defend themselves. "Maria," Carlos whispered, "what if there's fighting? What if we get hurt?" Maria wrapped her arms around her brother, trying to be the strong one even though she was just as scared. "We stay low and quiet," she replied. "Whatever happens, we stay together." The desert night brought its usual symphony of sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small animals moving through brush, and the whisper of wind across the sand. But tonight these natural sounds masked the approach of 7 Apache warriors, who moved like ghosts across the landscape. Ayana reached the back of the trading post first, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He could see the iron cages clearly now, and his heart ached at the sight of the frightened children inside them. Their eyes reflected the starlight, wide with terror and confusion. The warrior held up his hand, signaling for his men to wait. He wanted to assess the situation more carefully before acting. Through a dirty window, he could see the slave traders clustered together in the main room, their weapons ready but their confidence shattered. Suddenly, one of the traders made a fatal mistake. A man named Jake, driven by fear and desperation, burst through the front door with his rifle raised. "Show yourselves, you savages," he shouted into the darkness. "Come and fight like men." The words had barely left his mouth when an arrow whispered through the night air, striking him in the shoulder and spinning him around. Jake screamed and dropped his weapon, stumbling back toward the building as blood darkened his shirt. The attack had begun. There was no turning back now. Ayana rose from his hiding place like a mountain lion emerging from the shadows, his rifle aimed at the trading post. Around the perimeter, his fellow warriors did the same, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. "Release the children," Ayana called out in English, his voice carrying across the desert like thunder. "Release them now and you may live to see another sunrise." Inside the building, Bronson cursed and fired blindly through a window, the muzzle flash lighting up his desperate face. The bullet struck nothing but empty air, but it served as a declaration of war. The slave traders had chosen to fight rather than surrender. The night exploded with gunfire and war cries as the battle for the trading post began in earnest. Ayana and his warriors moved with the fluid grace of predators, appearing and disappearing behind rocks and brush as they tightened their circle around the desperate slave traders. Inside their iron prison, Maria pulled Carlos down to the floor of the cage as bullets whined overhead like angry wasps. The sound of breaking glass mixed with shouts and screams created a terrifying symphony that made the twins press themselves against each other for comfort. "Stay down, little brother," Maria whispered, her voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos surrounding them. She had positioned herself between Carlos and the direction of the gunfire, using her small body as a shield for the brother she loved more than her own life. Bronson and his remaining men had barricaded themselves inside the trading post, using overturned tables and sacks of grain for protection. The wounded Jake sat propped against a wall, pressing a bloody cloth against his shoulder wound while moaning in pain. His rifle lay forgotten beside him, useless in his weakened hands. "How many of them are out there?" Pete asked, his voice cracking with terror as he peered through a bullet hole in the wooden wall. "Don't matter how many," Bronson replied grimly, reloading his pistol with shaking fingers. "What matters is they got us surrounded. We should have moved those kids yesterday, like I said." The Apache warriors fought with a combination of ancient wisdom and deadly skill. They used the landscape to their advantage, appearing from behind boulders to fire a shot before melting back into the darkness. Their knowledge of the desert was complete, allowing them to move silently across terrain that would challenge even experienced frontiersmen. Ayana had positioned himself near the iron cages, determined to protect the children from any stray bullets. Through the bars, he could see the two small figures huddled together on the floor, and his heart ached for their terror. He had children of his own back at the village, and the thought of them in such a situation filled him with cold fury. A trader named Wilson tried to make a run for the horses tied behind the building, hoping to escape in the confusion. He had barely stepped outside when two arrows struck him simultaneously, one in the leg and another in his back. He fell face first into the dirt, his dreams of escape dying with him. The battle raged for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. The Apache fought with the patience of hunters, taking careful shots and conserving their ammunition. They knew that time was on their side. The slave traders were trapped with limited supplies and no hope of rescue. During a brief lull in the fighting, Ayana called out again in English. "Your friend Wilson will not be riding anywhere. Surrender now, and we will make your deaths quick and clean. Continue to resist and you will suffer as your victims have suffered." From inside the building came Bronson's defiant reply, "Go to hell, Apache. We got nothing to lose now." But Bronson was wrong. He still had his life to lose, and as the night wore on, even that began to seem like a small thing compared to the fear gnawing at his gut. He had seen what Apache warriors could do to their enemies, and he knew that death might be the kindest fate awaiting him. Maria pressed her ear to the iron bars, trying to understand what was happening in the battle around them. She could hear different voices calling out in a language she did not recognize, but the tone was strong and determined. These were not the voices of men who intended to give up. "Maria," Carlos whispered, his lips close to her ear. "The men with guns, they sound scared now. Maybe the other men will win?" Maria nodded, hardly daring to hope. She had prayed every night since their capture for someone to rescue them, but she had begun to lose faith that such a miracle was possible. Now, listening to the sounds of battle, she felt a tiny flame of hope rekindling in her heart. Suddenly, there was a tremendous crash from the front of the building. One of the Apache warriors had thrown a large rock through the main window, shattering the glass and sending the slave traders scrambling for new cover. The rock was followed by a burning stick that began to smolder against the wooden floor. "They're trying to burn us out," Pete screamed, stamping frantically on the smoking wood before it could spread to the rest of the building. The smell of smoke began to fill the air, adding another element of danger to an already desperate situation. The slave traders knew that if the building caught fire, they would be forced to choose between burning alive and facing the Apache warriors in open combat. Ayana watched the smoke rising from the broken window and nodded with satisfaction. His warriors were skilled at siege warfare, having learned from generations of conflicts with various enemies. They knew how to apply pressure gradually, like a snake slowly constricting its prey. But the Apache leader was also concerned about the children in the iron cages. If the building caught fire, the flames could spread to the area where Maria and Carlos were imprisoned. He needed to end this battle quickly, before the twins were harmed by the very rescue attempt meant to save them. The warrior made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing the siege, he would take a direct and dangerous approach. He would attempt to reach the cages and free the children, while his men kept the slave traders pinned down with gunfire. Ayana moved through the darkness like a shadow given form, his every step calculated to avoid making the slightest sound. The gunfire from his fellow warriors provided cover, keeping the slave traders focused on defending the front and sides of the building while he approached the iron cages from behind. The twin children looked up in terror as the Apache warrior emerged from the night like a spirit of vengeance. Maria instinctively pulled Carlos closer to her, unsure whether this painted figure represented salvation or another kind of danger. In the moonlight, Ayana appeared both fierce and magnificent, his weathered face marked with the wisdom of many battles. "Do not fear me, little ones," Ayana whispered in Spanish, his voice gentle despite the war paint on his cheeks. "I have come to take you home." Maria's eyes widened in surprise. She had not expected this fearsome warrior to speak her language, much less with such kindness. "Are you here to help us?" she asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, child. My name is Ayana. I'm going to get you out of this cage, but you must be very brave and very quiet. Can you do that for me?" Both children nodded solemnly, understanding that their lives depended on following this man's instructions exactly. Carlos wiped his nose with the back of his hand and straightened his small shoulders, trying to look as brave as his sister. Ayana examined the iron cage carefully, running his hands along the bars and the lock mechanism. The cage was solidly built, designed to hold adult prisoners, which made it more than strong enough to contain 2 8-year-old children. The lock was heavy and complex, beyond his ability to pick quickly. The sound of splintering wood came from the front of the trading post as another of the Apache warriors threw something heavy against the barricaded door. The slave traders inside were becoming increasingly desperate, their ammunition running low and their options disappearing with each passing minute. "The bars are too strong to bend," Ayana told the children quietly, "but the men who built this cage were lazy. Look here." He pointed to where the cage met the ground. The iron bars had been set into wooden posts, and the desert climate had dried and cracked the wood over time. The warrior pulled a long knife from his belt and began working it into the crack around one of the wooden posts. The dried wood was hard as stone in some places, but it had also become brittle. With patient effort, he began to work the post loose from its foundation. Maria and Carlos watched in fascination as this powerful man worked to free them. They could see the muscles in his arms strain against the stubborn wood, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. His movements were precise and determined, like someone who had never learned the meaning of surrender. A bullet suddenly whistled past Ayana's head, so close that it singed the hair above his ear. One of the slave traders had spotted him and was trying to pick him off through a back window of the building. The warrior threw himself flat against the ground, pulling the children down with him as more shots peppered the area around the cage. "Bronson's shooting at the cage," Pete yelled from inside the building. "He's gonna hit those kids." "Shut up," Bronson snarled back. "Those kids are worth nothing to us, dead or alive now. All that matters is getting out of this alive." The callous words reached Maria's ears, confirming what she had already suspected about the hearts of their captors. These men cared nothing for the lives of children, seeing them only as objects to be bought and sold for profit. Ayana rose to a crouch and continued working on the wooden post, but now he had to divide his attention between freeing the children and watching for more gunfire from the building. His fellow warriors increased their rate of fire, trying to keep the slave traders away from the back windows. The post began to give way with small, cracking sounds that seemed as loud as thunder in the night silence. Ayana worked faster now, knowing that time was running short. The other slave traders would soon realize what he was attempting, and they might decide to eliminate the children rather than allow them to be rescued. "Almost there," he whispered to Maria and Carlos. "When I pull this post free, the cage will open. You must both run to that large rock over there and wait for me. Do not look back no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Both children nodded, their eyes fixed on the warrior's face with complete trust. They had learned to recognize strength and gentleness when they saw it, and this man possessed both qualities in abundance. With a final, powerful twist, the wooden post came free from the ground. The iron cage tilted to one side, creating a gap just large enough for the twins to squeeze through. Ayana grabbed Maria's hand and helped her through the opening, then reached for Carlos. At that moment, Bronson appeared at the back window of the trading post with his rifle raised. He had finally realized what was happening and was determined to stop it. The muzzle of his weapon swung toward the escaping children, his finger tightening on the trigger. Ayana saw the danger and reacted with the lightning reflexes of a born warrior. He threw himself between the rifle and the children just as Bronson fired. The bullet struck the Apache warrior in the side, spinning him around and dropping him to one knee. But even wounded, Ayana did not cry out or show weakness in front of the children. Instead, he pointed toward the designated rock and gave them a gentle push. "Run now," he said firmly. "Run and do not stop." Maria grabbed Carlos's hand and they sprinted across the open ground toward safety, their bare feet silent on the hard-packed earth. Behind them, they heard the sound of Ayana rising to his feet despite his wound, his rifle coming up to return Bronson's fire. Maria and Carlos reached the large boulder just as Ayana's rifle cracked behind them, the sound echoing off the desert rocks like thunder. The wounded warrior's shot found its mark, and Bronson's scream of pain and rage filled the night air. The slave trader's rifle clattered to the ground as he clutched his shattered shoulder. The twins pressed themselves against the cold stone, breathing heavily from their desperate run to safety. Maria wrapped her arms around Carlos, both of them trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. They were free of the iron cage, but the battle still raged around them, and their protector was wounded. Ayana staggered toward their hiding place, one hand pressed against the bleeding wound in his side. Dark blood seeped between his fingers, but his eyes remained alert and determined. He had been hurt worse before and survived. What mattered now was getting these children to complete safety. "Are you badly hurt?" Maria asked in Spanish, her young voice filled with concern for the man who had risked his life to save them. "I will live, little one," Ayana replied, though his breathing was becoming labored. "But we must move quickly now. My warriors will finish this fight, but you need to be far away when it ends." The Apache leader whistled softly, a sound that mimicked a desert owl. Within moments, two of his fellow warriors appeared from the darkness, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready. They took one look at Ayana's wound and understood the situation without need for explanation. "Take the children to the horses," Ayana instructed in his native language. "I will stay and make sure none of the traitors escape." One of the warriors, a younger man named Nalnish, shook his head firmly. "You are wounded, brother. Let us finish this fight while you protect the little ones." But Ayana was already moving back toward the trading post, his rifle reloaded and ready. He had made a promise to these children, and Apache promises were sacred things that could not be broken by pain or injury. Inside the building, the remaining slave traders were trapped like rats in a maze with no exit. Jake had passed out from blood loss, slumped against the wall with his face pale as moonlight. Pete was crying openly now, his nerve finally broken by the hopelessness of their situation. Only Bronson remained defiant, though his wounded shoulder made it difficult for him to aim his pistol. "We should surrender," Pete sobbed. "Maybe they'll let us live if we give up now." Bronson laughed bitterly. "You think Apache take prisoners? You think they'll forget what we've been doing to their people? We fight until we die, or we die like cowards. Those are the only choices left." The building had begun to smolder in several places where the Apache fire arrows had found their mark. Smoke filled the air, making it difficult to breathe and nearly impossible to see clearly. The slave traders coughed and gasped as they tried to maintain their defensive positions. Outside, Ayana and his warriors had formed a tight circle around the trading post. They moved with the patience of hunters who knew their prey could no longer escape. Every exit was covered, every window watched, every possible hiding place anticipated. Maria and Carlos waited by the horses, their hands clasped together as they listened to the sounds of the final battle. The gunfire had become sporadic now, with long silences broken by single shots and shouted commands. They could sense that the fight was reaching its conclusion. "Maria," Carlos whispered, "when this is over, will we be able to go home? Will we see Mama again?" Maria looked toward the distant mountains, thinking of their village and the mother who was probably still searching for them. "I think so," she replied, though uncertainty clouded her young heart. "The kind man said he would take us home." Nalnish approached the children, his war paint making him look fearsome in the starlight. But when he spoke, his voice was gentle and reassuring. "Your warrior friend is very brave," he told them in Spanish. "He fights even with his wounds because he cares about your safety." The children nodded solemnly, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. These Apache warriors were risking their own lives to save two Mexican children they had never met before. It was an act of pure courage and compassion that would stay with Maria and Carlos for the rest of their lives. A tremendous crash came from the direction of the trading post as part of the burning roof collapsed inward. Orange flames leaped high into the night sky, casting dancing shadows across the desert landscape. The remaining slave traders would soon have to choose between the fire and the Apache warriors waiting outside. The choice was made for them when Pete finally broke completely. Unable to stand the smoke and heat any longer, he stumbled out of the burning building with his hands raised in surrender. He made it 3 steps before an arrow struck him in the chest, ending his participation in the slave trade forever. Bronson knew his time had come. Rather than burn alive or surrender to face Apache justice, he decided to go out fighting. He burst through the front door with his pistol blazing, screaming curses and defiance into the night air. His wild shot struck nothing but empty darkness before multiple arrows ended his reign of cruelty permanently. As suddenly as it had begun, the battle was over. The trading post burned like a giant torch against the desert night, consuming the evidence of countless crimes and sending smoke signals into the starlit sky. The slave traders were dead, their victims free at last. 3 days after the battle at the trading post, a small group of riders approached the Mexican village of San Miguel as the morning sun painted the adobe houses in shades of gold and amber. The villagers who spotted them first rubbed their eyes in disbelief, unable to trust what they were seeing. At the head of the group rode Ayana, his wounded side bound with clean cloth but his posture still proud and strong. Behind him, sitting together on a gentle mare, were 2 small figures that made the village women cry out in joy and amazement. Maria and Carlos had come home. Isabella was hanging laundry behind her small house when she heard the commotion from the village square. Voices were shouting her name, calling for her to come quickly. Her heart began to pound with a mixture of hope and fear as she dropped the wet clothes and ran toward the sound. When she reached the square and saw her children sitting on the horse, Isabella's legs nearly gave out beneath her. For 3 weeks, she had searched the desert, following every trail and asking every traveler if they had seen 2 8-year-old twins. She had prayed until her knees were raw and cried until she had no tears left. "Mama," Maria called out, her voice carrying across the square like the sweetest music Isabella had ever heard. The twins slid down from the horse and ran toward their mother, their bare feet kicking up small clouds of dust. Isabella fell to her knees and gathered them both in her arms, holding them so tightly that they could barely breathe. She covered their faces with kisses and whispered prayers of thanksgiving in Spanish. Ayana dismounted slowly, favoring his wounded side but managing to maintain his dignity. The villagers gathered around him with expressions of awe and gratitude, unsure how to properly thank a man who had returned their stolen children. Many had heard stories of Apache warriors but had never seen one up close, much less one who came as a friend and protector. The village priest, Father Martinez, stepped forward and removed his hat respectfully. "Señor," he said in careful Spanish mixed with broken English, "how can we ever repay what you have done for these children and their mother?" Ayana studied the priest's kind face and then looked around at the gathered villagers. These were simple people, farmers and herders who worked hard for everything they had. They possessed no great wealth, but their hearts were rich with gratitude and genuine warmth. "No payment is needed," Ayana replied in Spanish, surprising everyone with his fluency in their language. "Children should be with their families, not locked in iron cages like animals. This is the natural order of things." Isabella approached the warrior with Maria and Carlos still clinging to her sides. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as she looked up at the man who had risked his life to bring her children home. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver cross that had belonged to her mother. "Please," she said, holding out the cross with trembling hands. "This is all I have of value, but it comes with the blessing of a grateful mother. Take it so that you will remember our family, as we will always remember your courage." Ayana looked at the simple silver cross, understanding that it represented far more than its material worth. In the desert culture of both Apache and Mexican peoples, such gifts carried spiritual significance that transcended money or possessions. To refuse it would be an insult to Isabella's gratitude. The warrior accepted the cross and hung it around his neck, where it rested beside his own medicine bag. "I will treasure this always," he said solemnly. "And when I am old and sitting by the fire, I will tell my grandchildren about the brave twins who never lost hope, even in their darkest hour." Maria stepped forward and looked up at Ayana with eyes that seemed far too wise for her young age. "Will we see you again?" she asked. "Perhaps, little one. The desert is vast, but the paths of good people sometimes cross more than once." He knelt down to her level and gently touched her cheek. "But whether we meet again or not, remember that there are always people willing to fight for what is right. Never lose faith in that truth." The Apache warrior and his companions mounted their horses as the entire village gathered to watch their departure. Children waved from doorways while women called out blessings in Spanish. Men removed their hats and bowed their heads in respect as the riders prepared to leave. As they rode away from San Miguel, heading back toward the desert mountains that had always been their home, Ayana touched the silver cross hanging around his neck. He thought about the battle at the trading post and the price that had been paid for freedom. 2 children were safe with their mother, but the fight against those who would steal and sell human beings was far from over. Behind them, Maria and Carlos stood with their mother in front of their small house, watching until the riders disappeared into the shimmering heat waves of the desert. They would grow up to become leaders in their community, always remembering the lesson they had learned about courage and compassion from an Apache warrior named Ayana. Isabella kept one arm around each of her children as they watched their rescuer fade into the distance. The silver cross had been a small price to pay for such a miracle, but she knew that some debts could never truly be repaid. She whispered one final prayer of gratitude as the desert reclaimed its guardians, and the ordinary sounds of village life resumed around them. The twins were home, safe in their mother's arms, with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives about the night an Apache hunter burst through iron bars and tore apart the chains of slavery with his bare hands and boundless courage.